I want to start with a number, 4 billion. That's roughly how many mature trees of a single species vanished from the eastern half of North America in under 40 years. Not over a century. Not across some slow, creeping process of industrial expansion. 40 years. And I want you to sit with that number, because for the next 30 minutes, I want to ask a question that almost nobody who studies this era ever asks directly. Not what happened, not even how it happened, because the mechanics are actually well documented. The question is why an entire continent's free food infrastructure was allowed, and in some cases encouraged, to disappear at exactly the moment people needed it most. 3 years ago, I was researching something that seemed, on the surface, like a narrow botanical curiosity. A blight. A fungus. The kind of subject that gets a paragraph in a forestry textbook and nothing more. I kept running into the same phrase in old survey records and naturalist journals from the eastern United States. The chestnut belt. Before the 20th century, American chestnut trees, Castanea dentata, dominated an estimated 200 million acres of forest stretching from Maine to Mississippi. In parts of Appalachia, 1 in every 4 hardwood trees was a chestnut. Some of these trees grew over 30 meters tall, with trunks wide enough that early accounts describe families hollowing them out for shelter. And they produced food, not occasionally, not as a supplement. Every autumn, the chestnut belt dropped what naturalists at the time called mast crops of almost unimaginable scale, so heavy that observers described the ground disappearing under a carpet of nuts. Sweet, calorie-dense, storable for months without refrigeration or processing. Deer, turkey, bear, and passenger pigeons depended on it. So did people. Indigenous nations across the eastern woodlands had been managing chestnut-dominant forests for thousands of years, using fire to favor mast-producing trees over competitors, a practice ecologists now call fire stick farming, or anthropogenic forest management. European settlers who arrived later described chestnut orchards so productive that entire mountain communities built their autumn economies around the harvest, with no planting, no fertilizing, no irrigation required. By 1950, the American chestnut was functionally gone from the eastern forest canopy, not reduced, not struggling. Functionally extinct as a mature, food-producing species across its entire natural range. The official explanation is simple and, as far as it goes, accurate. A fungal blight, Cryphonectria parasitica, arrived on imported Asian chestnut nursery stock around 1904 and spread through a genetically vulnerable population with no natural resistance. That is the textbook story. And nobody disputes the biology. But here's where I started to feel the same pull I imagine some of you already recognize. The blight explains the death of the tree. It does not explain what happened next, and it does not explain why, when the chestnut forest died, nobody rebuilt a free food system in its place. Instead, in the very decades the chestnut was collapsing, the same regions were being converted, acre by acre, into something else entirely. Fenced pasture, single-crop tobacco and cotton allotments, and timber monocultures owned by companies headquartered hundreds of miles away. This raises a question the blight alone cannot answer. If a free, self-renewing food forest was already failing on its own, why did the response involve not restoration, but replacement, with a system that required rent, seed purchase, and market participation? Why was the disaster treated less like a loss to be mourned and more like an opening to be used? Let me give you a second data point, because the chestnut was not alone. The eastern oak savannas, vast open woodlands maintained for millennia by deliberate, low-intensity indigenous burning produced enormous annual acorn crops, a staple food source processed into flour by dozens of nations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. These savannas required active management, regular fire, to stay open and productive. Once that management was interrupted, first by disease and displacement, then by fire suppression policy imposed by colonial and later federal authorities, the oak savannas didn't simply stay wild. They closed in with fire-intolerant species, choked with underbrush, and lost most of their food value within 2 or 3 generations. Suppression of fire, something indigenous land managers had used deliberately for tens of thousands of years, was reframed by incoming authorities as a public safety necessity. And it had the specific, measurable effect of collapsing a free food system that fire had sustained. Once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere in the record. A complex, low-input, high-yield food system, actively tended by people whose management practices are barely acknowledged in the official record, followed by a disruption, sometimes biological, sometimes legal, sometimes both, followed swiftly by replacement, with a system that requires ownership, capital, and continuous participation in a market to produce the same calories the forest used to give away. And here is the part of the record that took me the longest to reconcile. These forests were never wilderness in the sense the settler imagination understood the word. The chestnut belt's density, the oak savanna's openness, the mast yield so reliable that entire nations built ceremonial calendars around them. These are not the signatures of an untouched landscape. They are the signatures of horticulture. Deliberate, intergenerational, landscape-scale food cultivation, carried out not with plows and fences, but with fire, selective harvesting, and seed dispersal, over a timescale most agricultural civilizations would find difficult to comprehend. And like in Australia, there was a legal doctrine sitting quietly underneath all of it. In North America, it went by a different name, the Doctrine of Discovery, formalized in a series of 18th and 19th century legal opinions and treaties, holding that land not visibly improved according to European agricultural standards was functionally unclaimed, available for grant, sale, and settlement. Under this doctrine, a fire-managed oak savanna, feeding dozens of communities, was not a farm. It was not property. It was raw material waiting for someone to make it productive, in the only sense the law recognized. I want to be careful here, the same way the doctrine's defenders and critics both are careful, because the details matter more than the outrage. I am not claiming any single person sat down and planned the chestnut blight, or that fire suppression policy was drafted in a back room with the explicit goal of collapsing indigenous food sovereignty. What I am saying is that when a biological accident and a legal doctrine and an economic system all point in exactly the same direction, toward the elimination of free food and its replacement with owned, managed, purchased food, the word coincidence starts to feel like it's doing an enormous amount of work. Because it wasn't just the chestnut. It wasn't just the oak savannas. When you widen the lens to look at what was happening across the rest of the continent in the same compressed window, roughly 1850 to 1930, you start to find the same signature repeating with a regularity that gets harder to explain the longer you look at it. If you're finding this line of inquiry compelling, drop a comment below and tell me which piece of this you want examined next. This community has found some of its best leads in the comment section, and this is exactly the kind of investigation that benefits from more eyes. In part 2, I want to take you through the Great Plains bison economy, the wild rice beds of the upper Midwest, and a piece of legislation most people have never heard of that did to individual land ownership what terra nullius did to an entire continent. Let's pick up where we left off, because the pattern that emerged in the eastern forests becomes even harder to dismiss once you look west. The Great Plains bison economy is usually taught as a story about hunting, overhunting, market hunting, the hide trade, the railroad. All true. But that framing quietly erases what the bison actually was to the people who had managed the plains ecosystem for thousands of years before European contact. Not a wild animal that happened to be hunted, but the mobile center of an entire deliberately maintained food system. Plains nations used controlled burning to manage grassland composition across enormous distances, favoring the specific grass species bison preferred, effectively managing pasture at a continental scale, without fences, without ownership, without a single acre of land requiring a deed. Estimates of the pre-contact bison population range as high as 30 to 60 million animals. A single herd could feed, clothe, and shelter a community for a year, entirely renewable, entirely free, requiring only the knowledge of when and where to be. Within roughly 2 decades, from the 1870s to the 1890s, that population collapsed to under 1,000 animals. The official explanation is commercial hide hunting combined with railroad expansion, and that explanation is accurate as far as it goes. But military and political records from the period complicate the tidy economic story. Multiple U.S. Army officers and federal officials wrote openly in memos and congressional testimony that survive in the archive today about bison extermination as a deliberate strategy to force plains nations into dependency on federal rations and reservation agriculture. This is not a fringe reading of ambiguous evidence. It is stated, in some cases explicitly, in the documentary record. The destruction of a free food system was, for at least some of the people orchestrating it, not a side effect of economic expansion. It was the plan. This is the part of the story that should reframe everything that came before it. Because if the deliberate destruction of a free food economy to force dependency was openly discussed policy on the plains, it becomes much harder to wave away the pattern in the eastern forests, in the Brigalow Belt, in the Murray-Darling, as pure coincidence layered on top of pure coincidence. Once you have one confirmed instance of intentional design, the burden of proof for calling everything else unrelated local circumstance gets a great deal heavier. Now let's talk about wild rice. Manumin, as it's known to the Anishinaabe and other nations of the Great Lakes region, is a grain that grows wild in shallow lakes and slow rivers across what is now Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario. It was never planted in the European sense, but it was managed with extraordinary precision. Water levels tended, competing vegetation cleared, harvest timing coordinated by community across entire watersheds, seed deliberately scattered to expand beds into new waters. It produced, and in the surviving beds still produces, a nutrient-dense, storable staple grain requiring no fertilizer, no plowing, no purchased seed, year after year, on its own. Beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating through the 20th, dam construction, water level manipulation for logging and hydroelectric power, and the introduction of motorized boat traffic destroyed the majority of historic wild rice beds across the region. Today, credible estimates put the reduction at somewhere between 50 and 75% of historic wild rice waters, depending on the watershed. The official explanation is industrial development, infrastructure, progress. And once again, that explanation is not false. It is simply incomplete in a very specific way. Almost none of the engineering studies that justified dam projects across wild rice country accounted for the grain beds as an economic asset at all. They were treated, in the paperwork, as if they did not exist. Which brings us to the piece of legislation I mentioned at the start of this section. The General Allotment Act of 1887, commonly called the Dawes Act, is usually taught as a policy about land redistribution. What it actually did was take collectively managed indigenous land that functioned economically the way the Big Scrub or the Brigalow Belt functioned, as a shared, actively tended resource base, and divide it into individual parcels of private property, typically 160 acres per head of household. Any land left over after allotment, and there was often a great deal left over, was declared surplus and opened to non-indigenous settlement. Between 1887 and the policy's reversal in 1934, indigenous-held land in the United States fell from roughly 138 million acres to about 48 million acres, a loss of nearly 2/3. Here is the mechanism I want you to sit with, because it is precise, and it repeats the exact same legal architecture we saw under terra nullius on the other side of the world. Collectively managed land, tended communally across generations using ecological knowledge that does not map onto European ideas of improvement, is legally illegible. It does not look like property to a court trained to recognize fences, deeds, and individual titles. Once it is legally illegible, it can be redefined as surplus, undeveloped, unclaimed. And once redefined, it becomes available not to be harvested as the food system it already was, but to be broken apart, individually owned, and made to conform to a very specific kind of economic participation: private title, cash crops, taxation, and eventually, when the land failed to produce under intensive single-crop use, the way it had under diverse communal management, foreclosure, and further transfer of title to non-indigenous owners. The wild rice beds drowned under dam projects that never accounted for them. The bison were shot by a policy some of its own architects described, in writing, as designed to create dependency. And the land itself was carved into pieces using a legal instrument that made communal food management invisible by design, then declared the invisible resource available for reallocation. 3 different mechanisms: biological collapse, ecological engineering, and legal reclassification, arriving at the exact same destination: a free, resilient, community-managed food system replaced by one that required individual ownership, purchased inputs, and continuous participation in a cash economy to produce the same calories that used to simply be there. I don't think any single one of these stories, told in isolation, would raise an eyebrow. Diseases happen, dams get built, land policy changes. It's the accumulation, the same shape appearing again and again across ecosystems, across legal systems, across a compressed 60-year window on a single continent, and then again on other continents in the same period, that makes coincidence feel like an increasingly strained explanation. In the final part, I want to bring this all the way back to the present, to what's actually growing back in some of these landscapes right now, to the economics of who profits from a population that has to buy what its ancestors used to simply gather, and to the question I genuinely cannot answer, whether anyone, anywhere, ever fully understood what they were building when they tore the old system down. So here's where all of this lands, and I want to be honest that the ending I have for you is not a clean one. Let's total up what we've actually established. A chestnut forest covering 200 million acres, feeding people and animals across half a continent with zero cultivation cost, reduced to functional extinction within roughly 40 years, its niche never rebuilt, its land repurposed into rented pasture and monoculture. Oak savannas that had been intentionally, patiently managed with fire for millennia closed over and rendered unproductive within 2 or 3 generations once that management was interrupted by policy. A bison economy supporting tens of millions of animals and an entire regional food system collapsed to fewer than 1,000 animals in 20 years through a campaign that federal officials at the time described, in their own words, as intended to force dependency. Wild rice beds, a renewable staple grain requiring no purchased inputs, reduced by more than half across their historic range by infrastructure projects that treated them as if they simply weren't there. And underneath all of it, a piece of legislation that took collectively managed land that worked economically the same way a food forest works, and legally dissolved it into individually owned, individually taxed, individually fallible parcels. Every one of these events has its own tidy local explanation: disease, infrastructure, market hunting, land reform. And every one of those explanations is, on its own terms, true. That's what makes this hard to talk about without sounding like you're reaching. No single thread, pulled on its own, unravels the whole picture. It's only when you lay them side by side, on the same timeline, across the same 60 to 80-year window, that a second pattern becomes visible underneath the first one. Every single case ends with the same outcome. A free, resilient, communally managed food system is replaced by a system that requires individual ownership, purchased inputs, and ongoing participation in a cash economy to produce the calories the old system used to give away. I keep coming back to the economics of that outcome because I think it's the part that gets skipped over the fastest in the official retellings. A person who can walk into a managed oak savanna and gather a season's worth of food does not need a wage, does not need a landlord, does not need to participate in a market that someone else built and someone else controls the terms of. A person who has to buy flour that used to come free from an acorn crop, or who has to lease pasture that used to be an open, shared grassland, has entered a completely different relationship to survival, one where somebody else, somewhere up the chain, now has leverage over whether they eat. I want to be careful, the way I was at the start of this. I am not telling you there was a single meeting where this was decided for an entire continent. What the documentary record actually supports is something a little different and, I think, a little more unsettling. That the individual pieces of this machine, disease response, water infrastructure, land law, agricultural subsidy, were each built by people operating within a shared set of assumptions about what counts as productive, what counts as ownership, and what counts as progress. And that shared set of assumptions, wherever it came from, produced the same result independently, over and over, on different landscapes, under different administrations, without needing a conspiracy to coordinate it, because the assumptions themselves were doing the coordinating. That's not a more comfortable explanation. In some ways it's worse. A conspiracy has an end point, a room, a document, a person you could theoretically hold accountable, a shared assumption baked into how a legal system defines property, how an economy defines value, how a government defines improvement, doesn't have an end point. It just keeps producing the same outcome, quietly, generation after generation, in landscape after landscape, without anyone ever needing to sign off on it twice. Here's what I think is actually worth sitting with. In the last 2 decades, something has started to shift. Indigenous-led restoration projects have replanted blight-resistant chestnut hybrids across parts of Appalachia. Controlled burn programs, run in partnership with the descendants of the nations who developed the practice in the first place, are being reintroduced to oak savanna remnants in the Midwest. Wild rice restoration efforts, led largely by Anishinaabe communities, have begun reclaiming stretches of watershed lost to a century of dam engineering. None of it comes close to restoring what was lost at anything like the original scale. The knowledge gap alone, the accumulated embodied understanding of exactly when to burn, exactly where to plant, exactly how to read a landscape across a human lifetime, cannot simply be looked up in an archive. Much of it was never written down anywhere, because it didn't need to be. It lived in people, and when the people were displaced, criminalized, or killed, a great deal of it went with them. So I want to end with the same question I keep circling back to, because I don't have a tidy answer for it, and I don't think anyone does. What do you do with a system that was never dismantled by a single decision, but that nonetheless kept arriving, continent after continent, at the exact same destination? Not through malice in every case, not through ignorance in every case either, because the Bison memos alone prove that at least some of the people involved knew precisely what they were doing. Somewhere between those two poles, deliberate strategy on one end and unexamined assumption on the other, an entire continent's free food economy was taken apart, piece by piece, and replaced with one that required money to operate. That's not a metaphor, that's the plain accounting of it. I know that's an uncomfortable place to leave this, but I'd rather leave you with an honest question than a false certainty. If you've made it this far, I want to hear what you think we're still missing, because the parts of this story that don't fit neatly, the parts that raise more questions than they answer, are usually exactly where the next real thread is waiting. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This community has found more in the gaps between these stories than in any single one of them told alone.